Welcome to the Living Wisdom Podcast. Today's episode is going to be a dialogue with two guests about the Black Mirror episode Nosedive. But before I introduce my guests and before we begin our conversation, I'd just like to briefly summarize the two monologues that precede this episode in the series of the podcast. These are monologues about Plato. The first is about Plato's psychology, and the second is about Plato's politics. But before I do that, I also want to just very briefly summarize two monologues that preceded a previous episode, and that's about Plato's cave and then about Foucault's panopticon. So I want to summarize those because I think even though I discussed those ideas in anticipation of a previous episode, Bandersnatch, I think that those are very important for understanding Nosedive as well. So Plato's cave, very briefly, is that there are prisoners at the bottom of a cave who have been raised there, and they can't distinguish the images on the cave wall from what is in fact not reality. They think that's reality because that's all they've ever known. And behind them are puppeteers who parade a series of models in order to create those images. That's important because for this episode, because we have in Nosedive a society where people are under a mass delusion, if you like, and we'll talk a lot more about what that delusion is, what its nature is. But in that respect, it's like Plato's cave, but it's unlike Plato's cave, I think, because there aren't clearly puppeteers. There aren't clearly manipulators who are in charge of the society, at least no one we've been shown. Some characters have more power than others, there's no doubt, the influencers and the reputelligence representative, but it seems they're also subject to the system. So that's why I just want to briefly mention Foucault's panopticon. In the prison called the Panopticon, which was designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, which Foucault discusses in his 20th century book called Discipline and Punish. In that prison, there is a warden in the middle of a circular arrangement, and the prisoners are in cells in that circular arrangement. Because the sun shines through the outside of the building, the warden in the middle in a tower can see them, but they cannot see him. So they are able to be supervised not only when he's there, but because they can't see when he's there and when he isn't, they feel supervised even when he's not there because they simply don't know when he's there and when he isn't. So what Foucault describes in that arrangement of a prison, which he takes as a metaphor for all of modern society, is that all of us feel supervised all the time. And because the warden can disappear from the tower and the prisoners can still feel supervised, so too in modern society, even when there's no supervisor, even when there aren't puppeteers, to go back to the Platonic cave analogy, we nonetheless regulate ourselves. And I want to discuss that probably in the conversation that's to follow. Now, a little bit more detail about the two monologues that directly precede this episode. Again, one on Plato's psychology, one on his politics. Plato believes that the soul has three parts. And what that means is that he thinks that there are three fundamental desires for human beings. Of course, we desire an infinite number of things, but he thinks those infinite desires can be categorized into three types. There is a desire for bodily satisfaction, the satisfaction of what he calls our appetites. And he calls that the money-loving part because with money, we can purchase the satisfaction of any one of those bodily appetites. In another part of the soul, another fundamental desire, we crave the esteem of others. And we could just go through a number of synonyms for what he's talking about. We crave the esteem of others, we crave their respect, we crave their recognition, we crave honor. And that's the word that he uses, especially as a Greek. And in the third part of the soul, which he calls reason, we desire, and this is a little strange to many ears and even to scholarly ears, sometimes scholars of Plato, reason here is not something separate from desire. Reason is itself a desire. It's a desire for what's really good. And in order to determine what's really good as opposed to what's apparently good, we have to perform an investigation into the world. We can't accept it merely as it appears. And so that's why knowledge is very important to reason. But knowledge is derivatively important to reason, because what reason really is a desire for the real good. And then knowledge becomes important because it's only with knowledge that we can get to the real good. So those are the three fundamental desires, the three parts of the soul. And Plato thinks that a virtuous person, someone who's living a good life, will live a life in which, or have a soul in which reason is dominant. What that means is that the person investigates what's really good, does her best to find out what's really good, and then lives according to that plan. What that means is that the spirited part of the soul, the part that desires social status, respect, recognition, and so on, that obeys the instructions of the decision about what's really good, so that that person will only want the esteem of people who also agree that that's really good. This becomes clear in a case, say, where you're in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, where there's a society that dispenses social status according to something that's not good. If you're a Nazi, you rise higher in social esteem, but that's bad. That a person who's living her life according to reason, according to Plato, would determine that that's bad and thus forego social status because she's more interested in what's really good. Whereas somebody whose soul is dominated by the desire for social status would join the Nazi Party, rise in those ranks, and would forego what's really good because her soul would be dominated instead by the spirited part. And then finally, someone whose soul is dominated by the appetitive part would be somebody who makes decisions based upon what will achieve the most money or the most satisfaction of bodily appetites. And reason isn't absent from the life of such a person. It's instead that reason will serve the goal of that part of the soul. So someone could become a Wall Street financier. This could be the most brilliant graduate from Harvard in that year, but he would be using his reason to get as much money as possible rather than finding out what's really good. So Plato has a notion of virtue, which is being dominated by rational desire. And the closest analogy to virtue we have in Nosedive is what's called a quality person. But in Nosedive, to be a quality person is not to be somebody who's virtuous in the Platonic sense, who's trying to find out what's really good. It's instead somebody who has a 4.5 social score or higher, and that's clearly somebody who cares more about social status. We'll talk more in the dialogue about this, but I think Plato's straightforward analysis of Nosedive would be, these are all people who are dominated by the middle part of the soul, the spirited part of the soul, which cares above all about social status, and they've foregone an interest in what's really good. Those quality people in Nosedive are not happy according to Plato's understanding of happiness, because happiness for Plato is when you live a life and you achieve something that's really good. But the only reliable way to achieve something that's really good is to make the pursuit of what's really good your goal, and in other words, to make that the dominant desire in your soul. That's when reason is leading your life. But the people in Nosedive, if this analysis is correct, are dominated not by their reason, but instead by their spirited desire, their emotions in the terms that I described in the monologue. And their goal is not what's really good, but instead what's apparently good, namely social status. That is, they want to seem good to other people. They want to appear good to other people. They're not concerned with what's really good. So they can't be happy. When Susan, the truck driver, lets Lacey into her truck, invites her in, and they start talking about happiness, Susan asks her what that is in Lacey's understanding. And Lacey's understanding is straightforward, that she'll have a high social score. She's bought into this mass delusion that happiness is the approval of others, seeming good in the eyes of other people. Susan stands for somebody who understands that happiness is not how you seem to other people, but how you are. And what's better is to be living a life that's really good rather than a life that's not really good or that merely seems to be really good. So that's a difference between Plato's understanding of happiness and Lacey's understanding of happiness, at least at the beginning of the episode and through most of the episode. But Lacey goes through a fundamental change, and that's one of the things I find most interesting about this episode. And to explain that change, I think it's helpful to consider the analogy, or the illustration, I should say, that Plato gives of his psychology. So there are these three parts of the soul that we've just described abstractly, and Plato compares them to creatures. So reason is like a little human being or a homunculus, and the spirited part of the soul is like a lion, or he sometimes says like a snake, but let's concentrate on the lion. And the lion makes sense because the lion gets angry, and it's especially the emotion of anger that Plato focuses on when he's talking about that middle part of the soul. Finally, the appetitive part of the soul he compares to a hydra, this mythical beast with many heads, which represents the many appetites of the human soul. And he talks about how these heads of the hydra can come into conflict with each other and fight each other, which I gather happens in the mythology as well. Well, so too our appetites can come into conflict. You can be hungry and want to get up, but you could be tired and want to stay in bed, and your appetites can fight it out and decide whether you're going to get up or whether you're going to stay in bed. So with that illustration of the soul, as if it's a a zoo of which, when things go well, the homunculus is the zookeeper, gives us an understanding of a soul well-ordered, that virtuous soul where the homunculus is in charge. But imagine, by contrast, a soul in which the homunculus has been deposed and the lion takes over. Then that's the soul of the person concerned primarily with social status. Or what's worse, when the Hydra takes over and the war between the many heads of the Hydra then becomes a war within the soul itself. When it comes to freedom, a really important notion in this episode, Nosedive, but I think also in Plato, that illustration of the soul in terms of the three creatures makes clear what Plato thinks freedom is. It's when the human being inside the human being is in charge. So if you think of yourself in these Platonic terms, then you think that you have within your soul a little human being. And what that's supposed to represent pictorially is that's really you. Reason is who you really are, the pursuit of what's really good for you. And if that little human being, that homunculus, is in charge of your soul, insofar as that's you, then you're in charge of your soul. You're in charge of your life. But if reason is not in charge of your life, if the lion or the Hydra is in charge of your life, then the little human being is a slave to those other creatures. And that's to say, you could have all of the external freedom. You could be rich, you could be wealthy in external life to an external observer, but in fact, you're a slave to elements within yourself. So Plato has here a notion of spiritual freedom. That is, what it is that makes you truly free within your soul. Psychological freedom, if you like. And with that in mind, Lacey, at the beginning of the episode, is spiritually enslaved. She is dominated by, let's say, the lion. She craves social status, and that becomes very clear when Susan interrogates her. She wants social status, if it weren't already clear from the many dramatic scenes. By the end of the episode, when she's in prison, when she's become physically enslaved, if you like, physically inhibited, physically controlled, no longer physically free, finally she's achieved spiritual freedom. Now, that's not to say she's a philosopher. She doesn't understand everything about the world that Plato would have her understand. But she's no longer a slave to the pursuit of social status. And I think that's dramatized by the shouting match she has with the cellmate, that is, with the other man in the cell, where she's yelling obscenities, which was the very thing that Susan had asked her about. How did it feel when you yelled obscenities in the airport? And Lacey's not even able to answer that question. She can only talk about the effect on her social status. She's not able to talk about how it felt because she's completely out of touch with her own soul. She thinks only about how her soul or her life seems to other people. So at the end of that episode, I think there is an optimism that although she's not yet a philosopher, she's broken away from the images on the cave wall. She's no longer enslaved to social status, but instead, having turned, has the possibility to climb out of the cave. Now, Plato's politics. Plato describes 5 constitutions. He thinks there are many, many more types of constitutions, but these are the 5 basic. And in my monologue, I talked only about 2. So I briefly discussed and basically skipped the first of them, which is aristocracy, which is the kind that he's recommending, the rule by the philosopher king, his famous Utopia. And then I went to the next one, which is called timocracy, a word that doesn't exist any longer in English. It just means rule by people who care above all about honor. He was familiar with a constitution like this in the instance of Sparta, the rival power to Athens, where it was the military that dominated the society. And it's in the military that you get a clear instance of people who care above all about honor. They try to win. They try to win wars, and they try to win competitions with each other, and it's all a big competition for honor. But remember, honor is just one of those synonyms for esteem, social status, recognition, respect, and so on. So even though we don't have a timocracy in Nosedive, where it's ruled by the military, we nonetheless have a rule of people who have succeeded in the pursuit of social status. So in that sense, it's a timocracy. The next constitution is oligarchy in Plato's description. Oligarchy is a society ruled by the rich. So this is a society ruled by people who are themselves ruled by their appetites, especially what he calls their necessary appetites, the one that are needed for survival. These are the people who pursue money and aren't distracted by what he calls unnecessary desires, cravings for luxuries and so on that would force them to waste their capital. All right, so with that just brief introduction, I want to introduce my guests. I'm lucky to have today two guests, Dr. Karin Arndt and Dr. Amanda Lowe. Dr. Karin Arndt is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Washington, D.C., and she works primarily with women. Her dissertation was in clinical psychology, and it was on women in solitude, which I think will make an interesting contrast with Lacey, who is a woman who is not in solitude, but preoccupied with the opinions of others about her. And Dr. Amanda Lowe trained also in clinical psychologist, and she's really crafting her own career. She does reflective counseling with both entrepreneurs on the one hand, and then in a connected practice with spiritually oriented people. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, and I should say to those listening that this is the first time I'm introducing these guests, but they will appear on later episodes of this podcast, which we recorded earlier. So this is their second appearance, but as far as my audience is concerned, your first appearance.
It's fun to time travel with you all.
That's right. That's right. So where should we begin our discussion? Is there anything in that summary of my monologues that piqued your interest?
Well, it's interesting thinking about honor and esteem. And honestly, this episode of Black Mirror really struck me somewhat like the old Twilight Zone episodes, in the sense that it was kind of a meditation on conformity and about the lengths that people will go to in order to achieve a kind of perfect conformity, because they believe that that's going to bring them some kind of virtue, some kind of deliverance in some way from the sufferings of day-to-day life. And as you were talking about, is it democracy,
yes,
which is about honor? It seemed to me that honor, yes, is about esteem, but I've always felt of honor as somehow also being somewhat intrinsic, where there's a kind of sense of the conditions under which you use your agency or energy or force, and the idea that you would not compromise that even for esteem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in this case, in this episode, it struck me how little honor there is anywhere, right? Because the idea is that you're, this poor woman, Lacey, and all of these other people stuck in this horrible panopticon, this technological panopticon, are, if they buy into it, right? Because the brother, for example, Lacey's brother, he doesn't buy it. He's a 3.7. That's good enough. He has his friends. He's, he does his thing. Apparently he's able to survive just fine. He can
afford great clothing.
Yeah, I mean, he's okay, and he, and when they're going to lose their apartment, he has somewhere to go.
Yeah,
right. He has a social network. He has people that care about him. He won't compromise his integrity in that way, and he seems okay. But the people who are really shooting for those upper levels, where, he has so many great lines in this about, like when she tries to apply to that Pelican Cove, he's like, what is that, a eugenics project? Or something like this idea that they're sacrificing everything for this esteem. That's totally false. And in my opinion, kind of without honor. So it's like, I don't know if I would draw it as the honor thing. I feel like there's something about honor that actually does have to do with a kind of intrinsic moral compass.
Yes.
And that has to do with, no matter what other people think, like you have a duty to your own honor that transcends the esteem of others.
Yeah. And there is also a socioeconomic price to pay, though, in the episode if you transgress that, because certain privileges are given to people who have a high enough score. So it's not simply that their ego is being bolstered by this a higher rating, but actually that it means something in terms of their, not necessarily to some extent, survival, like Susan's husband died because he didn't have that, the right rating.
But their bank account as well.
Yeah.
So
yes,
the eugenics place, Pelican Cove, gives you a discount of 20% if you have above a 4.5.
Or that one guy, Chester, he can't get into work because he dips below
2.5.
He dips below the 2.5 and the doors won't open, literally, for him to get into that building.
Well, and that's a clear instance of the conflict between honor in Plato's sense, at least as I described it, and reason, where Lacey recognizes the best thing to do is to swipe up on him, give him a 5 so that he can be above 2.5, so he can go into his job, and that might be the beginning of his recovery. She's really the decisive blow to him. He can't get in. He's going to lose his job. Who knows what happens to him after that? She knows what's the right thing to do, and she doesn't do the right thing because she knows if she upvotes him, other people will downvote her, and she needs that 4.5 so that she can afford Pelican Cove. So I just want to pick up on your point about how money and honor are intertwined in this episode. To get into Pelican Cove, you can either pay straight up or you can get a 20% discount if you have over a 4.5, so that the esteem of other people, namely high social score, saves you money. Mm-hmm. And Plato talks about democracy and oligarchy as if they're separate constitutions. I think this episode illustrates the ways in which a society structure around esteem or honor on the one hand and a society structure around money are intertwined.
Yes.
And Marx, I talk about Marx in a subsequent monologue, but Marx recognizes the connection of those two things in what he calls the commodity fetish, that people pay a lot for something, not so much because it's going to help them survive, but because other people want that thing too. So that's why people pay $5,000 for a Gucci bag, not because it's a better bag than other bags, but because other people esteem that bag. So money and esteem get intertwined.
And wasn't Charlie Brooker, wasn't he influenced by the Chinese rating system? I forget what that's called. That they were, I think it's supposed to take effect in 2020.
Yeah. I think he learned about it after the episode.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
I just read an interview today in which he says, and now they're doing it in China.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't influenced by that.
I don't think so, but I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I know back in something like 2015, I was involved in trying to figure out a way to apply my skills in the world of cryptocurrency. And one of the things that I was potentially interested in was they were trying to figure out these rating systems that would in some way kind of replace our traditional credit ratings. Because if you're doing these kind of transactions on the internet where people don't know you, and you're also not going to be, you're going to be bypassing like traditional institutions, how can you actually understand like whether or not you should trust someone? So sort of like the old eBay idea, right? Where it's like the more you do transactions, the more reliable you show yourself to be and all of that kind of thing. And so that I delved into that project for a little while trying to figure out like how do you do reputation systems? And it's a giant mess because the thing is that people fluctuate all the time. And there's people, like the idea where everything really falls apart for Lacey here because she has one argument with her brother, and that leads to this cascade of, crappy interaction after crappy interaction, which starts to then become kind of exponentially more damaging. And she gets down, I think, in the very end to something like 0.1. Zero. No, she gets below 1 when everyone's downvoting her at the wedding. Right. And the thing is that the idea that you could have some kind of like permanent objectified reputation system that would actually take everything into account. It's like, it's impossible, right?
You're right. It has a momentum. Karen and I were talking about this earlier, that when Lacey's on the highway and she's hitchhiking, people are just downvoting her because she's hitchhiking.
Exactly.
She hasn't done and she actually says, I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you downvoting? But it shows that once you get below a certain point, people are going to be cruel to you. And
like a homeless person.
Yeah. You can't
it's
get a job.
Really hard to get up from there.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah. But the thing is that when, one of the things I thought about when I was watching this again was the way in which, I feel like what's interesting about this episode is it kind of shows in a kind of objectified way, right? Because everybody's got the contact lens where they can see who everyone is, even if they're strangers, right? So everybody's reputation shows to everybody else immediately. And if you're plugged into that system, there you are, right? You're just in the system, and that's how it goes. And the thing is that that's a little bit more serious than how we actually have it, right? There is a flexibility that we have without having a technology like that, where those dynamics are still in play for all of us, right? We all have reputations, in fact. And the older you get, the more kind of cemented that becomes in some ways, because the more you know people and the longer you've had to interact with them, and the less people forgive you for stuff, because we forgive the young for being flakes and making mistakes. But the older you get, the less people forgive your mistakes because the more experience you're supposed to have and the more maturity you're supposed to have.
It used to be the case, although now with Twitter and social media, people go back and find what you said when you were 15 and hold it against you. Like that Harvard student who wasn't admitted because of something he'd done on his Twitter feed.
I find that to be unconscionable because, I just imagine I'm old enough that I didn't grow up with the internet as a teenager. And if I had, I would have done outrageously stupid things.
Yeah.
There would be nip slips all over the place. I don't know what I would have done. I would have said all kinds of messed up stuff. It's not even that I'm that big of a jerk, but I would have been so inexperienced that I would have made a bunch of mistakes because I wouldn't have been thinking about how my actions would have been taken. And, you know, these days I'm just kind of praying I die before the reputation systems come into effect. But I mean, you know, I'd probably be able to keep a good one because I'm old enough to be a little bit wiser about it. But still, it's, you know, yeah, I don't know. I mean, people still come back from those public shamings, though. Like Monica Lewinsky survived.
Barely.
She did. She did survive. She did. You know, and people do survive these things, and there is a resilience, and I feel like it's interesting. I think at the sort of the end of this episode, I kind of wish they made a whole series about this because I would love to see like what happened next.
Yes.
To Lacey,
right,
and what it was like for her to explore the world from this taken down place, even though she clearly probably has some education and some skills, and you know she is.
Yeah, my guess is that actually once she gets released from prison, I'm guessing she will be, and the thing will be re-implanted into her eye or wherever, that actually she'll go back to the same behavior, but with a slightly different take. But I feel like, as with Susan, it took a trauma to get her to take the red pill, you know, and actually go on the road and to try to step outside of the matrix. That I feel like Lacey, as we were talking about earlier, Patrick, like she's in an earlier developmental phase, first of all. And in some ways she hasn't sort of created herself in the world to the extent that Susan had when she made her break from the system. And maybe Lacey, to some extent, grew up with that system, so it became kind of a part of herself. Of course, we don't know when that system got started in the show. But the idea that she could somehow have this awakening experience, which it was. It's kind of like when people take psychedelic, you know, they take a psychedelic and they have this like eye-opening experience. Well, do they necessarily integrate that into their sense of self, no, I think it takes a number of times, or it sometimes takes falling on your ass and having a big trauma for the thing to really take a major effect. But I have a sense that she'd probably be right back at it, but a little bit wiser. And it might take a few more times around for something bad to happen, or I don't know.
You think she'd upvote Chess if she gets released from?
That's a good question. Yeah, that was probably the most unethical moment in the whole show.
Yeah, she knew it.
Yeah, she knew it. Yeah, I don't know.
You know, I don't know. It's interesting. I guess the interesting exploration there would be like what happens next in terms of like, who else does she encounter? Because I think part of how you take up those kinds of experiences, whether you integrate them or not, is whether or not you come across someone who can guide you through the integration experience. So having the encounter, what's the name of the truck driver? Susan. Right. So having the encounter with Susan, I remember I was watching really carefully her facial expressions, and there was this kind of like surprised delight when Susan was just being really real with her. Yeah. And she was like, oh. And then she even screwed up and said, well, I'm not as old as you or whatever. You know what I mean? Right. And she's like, I'm not going to downvote you. Let's just have a real conversation. She was like, right? Like there was that feeling of like relief.
She falls asleep, as you know.
Yeah, she was able to finally rest.
She rested. And I feel like she went the full Monty into a complete collapse here, which would lead me to believe.
Susan? Or?
No. It's Lacey. Okay. Like she really went the distance. Yeah. In terms of pushing this as far as you could go.
Well, she's demonic, as Kara mentioned before we got
like
on
at the final scene, well, not the final scene, but where she's at the wedding and she just, some of the things she screams. It's almost demonic. It's wild.
I'm going to cut off Mr. Regg's head and put it up my ass.
Yeah. And you fucked Greg, right? Yeah. Well, and even, I love that she calls the groom a jackhole.
That's the best part. I think that was my favorite part.
But the thing is that she really, like something happens there where she really loses it.
Yeah.
Not only does she lose it, she presses all the way to losing it. Like she actually has to like break into the place to get there. She doesn't just like bust in the front door.
Yeah.
She has to like go back through the mud, through the reeds, and she has to get over these like the barbed wire and avoid the security. And you know, the thing that makes me think that maybe this could be the beginning of a real integration is that it seems like in her relationship with her brother, and even in the part where she initially goes to the consultants about how to raise her her metrics. She was more real before.
Yeah.
So there's some period of time in which she decided that she was really going to make an effort in this way.
Because the brother points that out.
And the brother's like, do you remember when we used to have real conversations? Like, who are you being? You're like, why are you doing this? And when she goes into the place where they do the analysis of the metrics, she has like a pretty straightforward upward direction, which indicates that she's really been working on it.
True.
And so I feel like there's a kind of way in which she has a foundation, even though she's in an earlier developmental phase. I feel like she has a kind of foundation of realness where she kind of knows something like what it feels like to be.
But you really need a community to be able to support that.
So like the other episodes I'd want to see that we're exploring it would be like, does she meet an interesting guy who's
that guy
real?
in prison?
Yeah, the guy in prison. Like,
married,
do they?
course.
Yeah, I mean, do
Support
they
each other in
go?
spiritual growth?
Do they become like bums who wander the earth together? You know, like who like, because when you find others, that's really like the pathway that you can go down. If she were to come out and just be like alone and have nothing, then yeah, of course she'd have to go back to it. She'd have to get a job at the coffee shop or wherever they would employ her.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like the whatever she would have to do to just kind of scrape by.
There are these alternate communities within the world of Nosedive. So the brother's got his friends of video game players.
Which I think is interesting that it's virtual reality.
Yes. Well, and she teases him, and doesn't he say something like, well, at least I know this is a game. Whereas you play your social game, you think it's real.
Yeah. Right.
And then the Sea of Tranquility people.
Oh, yeah, the cosplay people.
That's a kind of community. And I noticed for the first time just watching it again this afternoon that when they're in the stalls in the bathroom, one of them says, yeah, you know, when my dad found out I was going to TrankCon, he gave me a 1.1. And she doesn't really care. Or he downvoted me, or he gave me whatever.
Yeah.
And she seems contemptuous of the whole social score thing. Like, she's got her esteem from her TrankCon friends.
Right.
She doesn't get it from baristas who gave her a 5 because she bought a cookie.
Well, I mean, one thing that really struck me as I was watching the episode is that I've been involved in sort of subcultures all of my life since I was about 12 or so. I sort of started to break from the regular esteem sort of prestige network and start to be involved with people that other people thought were not as nice or good, and
Not quality people.
not quality people. Yeah, not quality people, you know. And you know, and there's a whole, you know, there's so many different subcultures, and of course they all dislike each other because they think the other ones are trash or whatever. But the thing is that there is this real liberatory experience of being with other people that are also rejected by the, you know, the quality people, the best of the best. And there's a freedom that comes with that that's quite remarkable. Now, people get stuck in that, and there's all kinds of ways in which that isn't done well, and there's ways that people can very psychologically defensively get stuck in these sort of, you know, unfortunately narcissistic ways of being attached to being like the rebel or the loner or the whatever, the loser, blah, blah, blah. But there is that experience of having been blown out of the regular system and having to sort of be with others in this place that's sort of a no man's land kind of thing. It gives you potentially a strength and a real resilience in the face of those kinds of things. And I kept rooting for Lacey to find, you know, what would for me be like the old punk rockers or whatever, who took her in and were nice to her, even though she was a 1.0 or something. You know, I was imagining her like being stuck in some like horrible squat in downtown, you know, Technoville or wherever, you know, and making friends with the TrankCon people, you know, like, and somehow being accepted by them because she's really down on her luck, and then figuring out who she really is.
And how is that more than just substituting one craving for social esteem for the craving of the social esteem of other people? I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Well, I would say when it's really genuine, it's like with Susan, where Susan insists that she needs help because in fact she does, and we all know she does, right? She doesn't want to take a ride with Susan because she thinks she's a 1.4. She's scared. And she's like, do you need help? And she's like, no. She's like, you look like you do.
Sure. Yeah.
Loved her accent.
Oh, and yeah. Well, and the thing that there's a way in which there's an opportunity to be real about what's actually happening, or even like at the end when they're in jail and they're insulting each other like delightedly, right? Where what's so crippling about being in a certain kind of sort of conformist prestige system is that you can't have a real feeling. You can't have a real thought. Everything has to be run through the what will people think filter. Mm-hmm. And when you end up sort of on the other side of things, where you're out there in the, outskirts of town or equivalent, yeah, there's a bunch of people who aren't so great either. But then there's other people who are truly capable of holding space for you being really real and aren't going to be offended if you insult them because you're in a bad mood, or if you insult them because you're a jerk. Like there's a world in which assholes can be accepted too, or people who are moody can be accepted. People who are, really lusty, people who have any kind of human characteristics where you have your own qualities and features. When you find a community where people can accept you in that, that's not the same as seeking a kind of, conformist esteem. That's the thing where people actually start to give you what you might call a real love. Something like a real acceptance that's about, not just about how your behavior affects them or anything like that, but about seeing you as a full human being. And I think that's different from this kind of notion of conformist esteem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in this episode, I guess we don't get that. We get individuals like the brother, like Susan, like the guy in the prison. And then the only alternate community we see is Trancon.
Right.
And, they're very conformist. If you don't know the gender of that character, who ends up being gender fluid.
I would say she lied to them, though. Like, I wonder how they would have treated her. I thought about this when I was watching it. I wonder how they would have treated her if she would have been like, listen, I'm totally screwed. Mm-hmm. I need a ride. Would you guys and is there any way I could get a ride with you guys?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Because I think a lot of people who are on that kind of side of things don't like people who are fake. Mm-hmm. Because they're looking at her and she looks like some kind of uptight, stuffy, former 4.2er.
Right. Using them because she got a flat tire.
Using them and thinking she can fool them about something that they really care about.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're saying people on the outside care about realness. And then the Reputelligence guy says high 4.7s or whatever can smell fakeness.
Yeah.
Like when she tries to give the croissant to the woman who has the 4.7 in the elevator.
He said they can smell it. It's impossible to respect, right? Desperation is impossible to respect. Right. And in fact, that's true, right? Because the thing is that the idea of how do you become a really highly well-respected person in any community, regardless of whether it's inside or outside of these walls, the truly well-respected, someone who is deserving of this deep respect, is someone who is actually a good person.
Right.
And that's not a disciplined person. That's not a person who's playing the game that society wants them to play. That's a person that wouldn't fit well into this system.
Discipline in Foucault's sense.
Yeah, and in Foucault's sense, yeah.
I think it's interesting because I've really spent a lot of time trying to sort out whether or not you can be a good person inside and outside of what systems, And it seems like there are some people who are able to be inside of these discipline systems and nonetheless, somehow through some kind of miracle of nature, they magically are somehow authentically able to truly be virtuous. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how that happens or why that's the case.
Or to be able to keep it in its place. People who are able to use social media but not be used by it or have it monopolize their lives, or to understand that it's a game and not believe, the presentation that that they understand that they're presenting a false self to the world largely, and that others are as well. And it's just part of the way our world works, and you're agreeing to participate in that. That there's some power in that, being able to choose, the degree to which but you really need to be able to have some kind of witnessing quality, the ability to stand back and see what's happening and not get as sucked in. But it's very hard not to get.
Especially in the world portrayed in the film, where nobody has any time to themselves. Everything is...
That's our world.
But every interaction you have in this society, there are no strangers, right?
This being Nosedive or our society?
In Nosedive.
Okay.
In Nosedive, there are no strangers anymore, right? We still have a strangerness potential.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's with the contact lenses that they have, everyone they see, even no matter whether they know them or not, they get their name and their rating. And in our society, still, when you walk down the street, people look at you and they see your clothes and all that kind of stuff, and they see what kind of car you drive or not, or whether you're on the bus or what building you're in with them or not. But there's lots of people who are still strangers.
Some degree of anonymity is permitted. Because in Nosedive, they don't permit people to not have the implant,
That's right.
It appears that. Well, that's one of the episodes I'd like to see in the entire series, is whether there's the people who've gone without the implants.
Well, does Susan have an implant? We don't have any.
Yes, because she knows what number Lacey has.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't look like a 2.8 or whatever.
Yeah. 1.4.
At that point,
Well, and she also has a feed, right? Because Lacey checks her feed.
The feed, the images, there's I think a glass of whiskey in Susan's feed. And there's also a really quick image of like a Buddha type of.
Was there?
Very quick, like split second.
It seemed like a little miniature Buddha.
I thought there was a cat. I don't know. Is there a cat?
Probably. That would fit.
Yeah.
So she's posting to social media.
Yeah. She also has a feed, right? You know.
But there's these, Buddhism and alcohol, which is what she gives Lacey to be her escape hatch, which is what she takes to enables her to actually speak truth, to the wedding crowd. That those are all... Okay, I completely forgot what I was about to say. Sorry.
That's okay.
Buddha, alcohol.
Yeah, they're all escape hatches. I mean, she's maybe in her social media feed, she's trying to subtly put these messages out to people like, these are ways out of the matrix. Some are maybe healthier than others, but Buddhism is understood to be a way to step outside of,
your desires.
Yeah.
Well, Karen mentioned earlier, and I hadn't noticed this, that the 2 thermoses that she gives her are blue and red. One is coffee. You're going to be like hype. You're going to amp up and stay within the system. Or whiskey. This is the way out. This is the red pill.
And
the red thermos.
she left her the red thermos. Yeah. I bet you that was probably intentional.
I can't imagine it not being. Yeah.
Oh, alcohol.
Yeah.
Speaking of minor details that have to be intentional, what about, and this is very minor, but the way all of the highways are elevated. There's one scene that's like a helicopter, plane look down, and it's like a Blade Runner scene, just all these intertwining highways.
Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts about that?
I did not, frankly. I mean, I noticed it, but it just reminded me of living in California.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we started to think about, all the traffic that's going on above, and then occasionally you see a car on the ground, like Susan's truck is on the ground.
She drops her off like under the underpass.
Yeah.
So there's something about, and that aerial shot was almost, it's a human made system of roads and technology with the cars.
Yeah.
It's almost like a snapshot of the web in some ways.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
And how to get underground, how to, in some ways, come back to Earth, instead of this virtual reality that we're living in.
Well, Lacey Pound gets down to Earth when she gets on the ATV and then crashes into the river.
Okay, I have to say, one of the things, this is really the only thing that I did not buy, is that there's no way that kid would have loaned her his quad.
You don't want to hear Karen's theory.
Oh, do you think she did something for that?
This is really inappropriate.
Because I was like, there's no way.
Once you take the red pill, you're willing to do a lot of things.
Well, I wondered why she didn't just have him drive her, just ride on it, get him to take you.
She needed to take herself.
That's right.
I guess, yeah.
And she needed that figure, if we think about it psychologically, like perhaps that figure of the guy who was on the ATV was some part of her own psyche. If this is like all about her individuation journey that helps her and sort of enables her to get where she needs to go.
I liked her on the ATV on the highway, and the cars are getting out of the way. She's like a Valkyrie.
Yeah,
that was so great.
Well, even it's interesting. I thought about the kid on the ATV. Like, I know a couple people who are like quad dudes.
Yeah,
who
that the name?
No. I mean, that's what I'm calling them. But like guys who have quads, young guys who would be like that kid.
Yeah.
That guy like going and making a mess in the mud.
Yeah.
In the margins. Right.
Yeah.
And there's always something I've really appreciated about there is a certain kind of thing I've always appreciated about a certain kind of young masculine dude when they're not like being intolerable to me. I don't know. I mean, there's a way in which they can be really gross, but there's also this way in which like you got this giant, well, not giant, but like you've got this very powerful machine and you're doing whatever the fuck you want with it.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really have been inspired by male behavior in the past, where like part of what I've sort of really appreciated and learned from the young and older men in my life that have really meant something to me is like, you know, ride that fucking quad. Like, who the fuck cares? Just tear that shit up. Yeah, it's somebody's lawn. Who cares? Like I'm riding this quad. I'm doing this thing. And I'm just like putting all this mud in your face. Yeah. And I'm doing it.
Just take action.
And who cares? Yeah. And that has been a giant lesson for me so many different times to be like, I'm revving the quad and the mud is going in your face, not mine. Smell you later. Like that's it.
Well, this raises a huge question, which is the gender of Lacey. How important is it? And this is bait, really. How important is it that she's a woman and not a man? Could the same story be told about a man?
I think it'd be far less effective. I don't think it would be as interesting.
Say why.
Say why. Well, I mean, why is that? There is, I don't want to make any gross generalizations, but there's some, I mean, clearly there's a lot to do with her physical body. And if you look at the pictures, like her nemesis of Naomi, like those images are all of her breasts and her body. And Lacey's Pound, her last name, you know, the first opening, the opening scene is her jogging to try to lose weight. This emphasis on the female body and the discipline of the female body in order to be upvoted. It's not, and not to say that men in that system aren't trying to look good, but it's
they're not half naked.
They're not half naked. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I feel like, you know, this is kind of a gross generalization, but I think it's still, I mean, it's starting to be more and more muddy, but I think it's still the case that men are conflated with their achievements and women are conflated with their looks. Like, that's the first place you go. Like, so if a woman has tremendous amounts of achievements, but she's not very attractive, people would be like, yeah, well, she works for NASA and she's an astronaut, but she's still kind of a fat pig. Yeah. Right. And if a dude's like really good looking, but you know, works at a coffee shop. Can't wait. Well, I mean, maybe he can get some action, but he's not going to be seen as like the pinnacle of masculinity. Yeah. Right. You know, he's going to be seen as like, oh, he's a hot piece, but,
where's the rich and powerful men who are ugly or good?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You don't, you know, my dad used to say, I remember when I was a kid, I asked my dad, I was like, why is that really good looking lady with that not very attractive guy? And he's like, well, he's a lot taller when he stands on his wallet. You know, and, you know, in this case, I think also one of the things I noticed as a kind of motif was the way that, you know how women do that like fake woman talk? Yes.
Yeah.
It's like,
Naomi. Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right, that's good. And the taxi driver cannot.
And the taxi driver's like,
I mean, women are socialized to be people pleasers.
Yeah, well,
I mean, largely. I mean, men have their own socialization, but this idea that you're supposed to be pleasing, don't disrupt things, keep the peace.
Well, it was your comment about the quad dudes that provoked this question. Yeah. You were saying there's something about masculinity, these teenage boys, that makes it easier for them to just spin out and put mud on people's property.
Well, and it's really been an inspiration to me to feel like, to notice that if you disrupt other people through your expression of your own desire, right? Which is in this case with the quad guys to like make a mess and, you know, go fast and, you know, be rough, right? They're not killing anybody actually. Like this, that's not like the kind of masculinity that's just going out and killing people or something. They're making a mess. They're causing people some problems, but everybody survives and it's fine. And for me as a woman, and particularly when I was younger as a girl, the idea that I could transgress other people's like sensibilities and that everything would be fine afterward was a real revelation.
Yeah.
You know, this idea that I could insult someone like Lacey insults Susan accidentally by just spontaneously saying, well, you're a lot older than me.
You wouldn't get it.
You wouldn't get it, right? You know, like being able to really just have an impact on others that's potentially disrespectful or actually disrespectful even, you know, to be aggressive and to have that be something that's part of the resilience of a human relationship.
Yeah.
That's something that's been a real gift to me from hanging out with some kind of dickhead dudes.
I think that's what I experienced as an adolescent. I mostly had male friends, and I really admired their bluntness, their straightforwardness, and the following of desire. You know, the idea that one could have a desire and actually just move out into the world based on that desire.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of it was a revelation for me.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Although I do feel that, you know, I mean, in this case.
It was a revelation for me too, by the way. as a boy, it takes a lot of courage. For example, the dance. That's, you know, at least when I was going to dances in 8th grade, all the girls stood against the wall and the guys were against the other wall, but the guys had to go over and ask the girls. And that was terrifying to go over, and you might get rejected. So what do? You wait throughout Stairway to Heaven until the last 30 seconds. And then you go over and she's already been taken.
And you still practice it though. Like you still, or some boys don't, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
But it does build a tolerance for being able to fail.
Well, and I think, you know, it's interesting that the brother is the authentic one in this story, right? Because the thing is that, you know, what I would say, you know, the best mentoring I've gotten about how to deal with like trying and failing or trying and rejection has often come from men. And because they're in this situation where they're constantly being brutalized by other men and like constantly having to face like rejection and failure, like overtly. And this is something that's out front for boys and men. That the idea that like you might try something and somebody's going to beat you up or somebody's going to win over you. That's overt for men. And there's a way in which for women that always has to be like covert. On the other hand, you know, the thing that I think that I've been able to do and other women I know have been able to do for the men and boys has been able to be like, okay, let me show you how to like be really upset about something or be really crushed or devastated or like even, you know, feel like you don't know what's going on. Like you don't have to have it together all the time. Like let's just collapse here in a pile and not know what's going on and have some sort of tender, gentle moments where things are really unclear. But in this case, like in this story, the brother is her call to authenticity because he doesn't collapse into that space of needing to please the others. And I think that that's actually a kind of a warm message about some of the best ways in which some men can be helpful to some women. You know, where, you know, my husband regularly, when I'm, you know, dithering, and I'm an outrageous person and I transgress all the time. And I try to be respectful because I'm not trying to be a total jerk all the time. But I've got a lot of courage in that way. My husband, when I'm dithering about being upset about whether or not I've transgressed in a wrong way, he's just like, who cares? Just be yourself. And he's that voice to me that allows me that freedom.
So Lacey, you know, at the wedding reception has disrupted everything, finally pulling out the knife. But when somebody trips her and she falls down and they're putting her in the arm lock, she starts giving her original speech. Do you think she's regressing and trying to be accepted at that point? I mean, I don't know what sense to make of that.
It didn't seem like a conscious attempt to win at that point. It was more like it was a regression and some kind of safer way of being.
And you know, she gets pulled out. And she's spectral at that point and saying, I love you. And what sense do you make of her profession of love at that point?
I think a part of her did love her, you know, but like almost all relationships, it's a mixed bag. So I do think that there was some form of love there. I don't think it was simply.
Oh, sorry.
Perhaps. I mean, I don't know if that's, you know.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I think she recognizes that it's a difficult's an understatement. It's a pathological love.
Yeah.
Because she says, for example, I spent my whole life looking up to you,
Yeah.
which means you spent your whole life looking down on
Yes.
me. So she
Yes.
recognizes the nature of the relationship.
Yes.
Obviously, you fucked Greg really crystallized.
Yeah.
But then when she says, I love you, I think she's saying,
Yeah.
despite all that, I still love you. There's
But she's-
something wrong with my
yeah,
love.
but she's speaking from a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, like if she's regressed back to
Yes.
10, she really loved her. And so
Yes.
there's this just desperate, flat on her ass kind of.
I want to
cry.
be loved by you,
Yeah.
even though you're so mean to me. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that really gets to her problem. She wants esteem and social status,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the price, no matter
Yeah.
how undignified she has to be.
Yeah.
That, and I feel like, I don't know, it really spoke to me about the complexity of the politics in female relationships. It made me think of my best friend from high school who was prettier than me, but also more pathological than me, kind of quite similar to this experience in some ways, or like in Lacey with Naomi. And there's something about being able to, like when you're friends with someone as a younger person, like as a child or even as a teenager, there is a level in which those relationships have a reality that sometimes adult relationships don't, because there's a way in which children can't fully pretend to be somebody that they're not. And even teenagers really fully can't. You know, I mean, unless they're really in a place that's quite disturbed.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for teenagers to completely hide who they really are. And it's like there's probably something about Naomi, because she is a human being, that is truly lovable. And in fact, they probably did have some kind of real loving connection. And there's some kind of way in which the complexity of, it's like Naomi and Lacey were both using each other for the wedding. That was true. They were both using each
Yes.
other.
And Naomi makes a good point.
Yeah,
You were
she's
doing
like,
this
you're
too.
doing it too.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, also, because Lacey's the one who decided when she thought about the strategy, she's the one who posted the picture of Mr. Rags to begin with. And that gave Naomi the idea to invite her, right? She's like, oh.
Yeah. And in some ways, Naomi is more caught in the system than Lacey.
More caught
She
in the
has more
system.
to lose.
She has more to lose.
Yeah.
She's the one who, she said, I haven't dropped
I did-
below a
yeah.
7 in
like a month.
6 months. In
6
6
months.
months. You know, and so she's
so much hard work.
It's so much
Yeah.
hard work. And so she has to, you know, all the video calls with her are her like walking through her house in her like bikini
Yeah.
or like doing
Do
yoga.
moves. Yeah.
Like very complex yoga without any mindfulness, of course. but the thing is that it struck me that there was actually something real between them. Like, especially when she's giving the speech to her brother, and he calls her a sociopath, but she's giving the speech to her brother and all the pictures are
You can
flashing
see it in
of
the
them.
pictures. Yeah.
You know, the pictures of them as children, like they really did
Yeah.
love each other. And in that moment when she gets knocked down, she's like, wait, like she really did speak to me because she saw I was scared. And we really did love each other.
And she did hold my ponytail while I puked into
She
the
did.
wrapper.
And she did. And she helped me make Mr. Rags. And there was, I think, genuinely a real friendship there. And but it's also poisoned by both of their pathologies. And the thing that people often don't say is that the prettier girl often has so much more pressure. You know, it's like we all focus on the one who's the one down girl who's a little too chubby or whatever, not as attractive. But the girls who are really, really pretty, they get the message very early that that's what's valuable about them. And if they don't maintain that at all costs, they're done.
Yeah. It's like there's less of a chance of liberation.
Way less of a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I've gotten older, I've really appreciated the fact that I wasn't like on that level of the 8, 9, 10 pretty because, you know, I had to take my lumps early and realize that I was just a regular person. And that was actually a great gift, even though it was very devastating to realize that I wouldn't be as pretty as Christy Brinkley in 1986.
In 2019.
Well,
She's
now,
still at it.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
So if this were a nosedive for with a male character, you think that instead of preening in front of the mirror and up talking and the various things you've pointed out, instead the male character would be doing different things. He would be trying to get ahead in the marketplace.
I think so.
And yet social media just being so visual based on images, it's I don't know if that captures as much, because this seemed to be more of an Instagram-ish world even than Facebook, less text. So based on images, I don't know if that can be communicated as effectively.
Holding the football that shows you're the quarterback.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about it today. So there's two pieces, right? One is that dude Chester. So he was with another dude in a relationship, and then they broke up, and everyone sided with the other guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Obviously.
And her first reaction was like, "Oh, he must feel terrible." He's like, "No, we're on the other guy's side." And I was like, "Oh my God, third grade." Yeah. That's like third grade right there. So there's that, right?
Or 48, depends.
Yeah. So then, but then like today, I was thinking about coming here today, and I was on LinkedIn. I don't know if you guys spend any time on LinkedIn.
No, I'm getting invitations all the time.
So LinkedIn is basically like social media for business people.
Yeah.
And sounds terrible.
Well, here's the thing. So I'm not a social media hater, although I feel like Facebook is the Velveeta of social interactions. It melts nicely, but that's about it. And I've been on a lot of different social media platforms. I never was able to use Twitter, but I've done a bunch of different social media things. And I'm on LinkedIn because I'm in business now, and I deal with business people. And it really is kind of like a big, old-timey Rolodex, where it's like a way that you genuinely can connect with other people and develop your business. So it's actually functional in that way. It does something for you. And people on LinkedIn, I was noticing this today. First of all, you don't have to be good looking on LinkedIn because it's all about business.
There's no pictures?
No, there's pictures. But you don't have to be attractive because it's just about whether or not you're doing good business. Like the achievement is the focus, right? So it's nice if you're good at taking photographs, but it's not as artistic, as some of these other ones. And it's not about like attractive young people, because it's about whoever is good at doing business stuff, which is often older, less attractive people, comparatively speaking. And it's a place where people are less likely to say really insulting and terrible things because
they're trying to get ahead.
Because people are trying to not appear to be total jackholes, as Lacey would say, which is not true on the other ones, right? Yeah. Like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, people act like total like crazy people.
On Instagram, I haven't found that on Instagram.
People will still make terrible comments on Instagram. Okay. But not all the time, but it's one of those things where
Twitter's the worst.
Twitter is terrible, and Facebook is also terrible. But on LinkedIn, it's a bunch of people posting photographs of their business dealings. And I feel like there would be a kind of LinkedIn situation if we were going to have a male character here. Where it would be like, like I just closed this deal with, ag tech or whatever, right. And that's how they would make it look, do you have the right suit, whatever.
Maybe just changing the topic slightly. This philosophical issue I raised at the beginning, the difference between Plato and Foucault about are there puppeteers in this world? And I think the best candidate would be either the influencers, the people with high 4.8s, because when they give you an upvote, it counts more apparently than if a regular person gives you an upvote. So they've got more influence. And then the reputelligence agent. So I think he'd be the best candidate for. Do you think he's a puppeteer? Is he in control of the system, or is he a prisoner as well?
He seems like a prisoner, as do the high, the social influencers. Yeah. I mean, there's someone who's putting these implants into people's faces. There's someone who's benefiting from this financially. There's some power. There's some larger thing here. It's like pointing at the finger at people who are themselves caught up in the system and are victims of the system. Yeah.
So there's a Zuckerberg behind all this, and he's just not shown.
And but even Zuckerberg, like, is he a free agent here?
Yeah. The Social Network. Do you remember that movie?
I didn't see
Sorkin
it. Sorkin
movie, and the final scene, he's invented Facebook, and he's trying to get in touch with this girl who's dumped him, and he just keeps he's friended her. And she won't friend him back, and he just keeps hitting refresh. And it just shows him like hitting refresh 20 times. And he's very much caught up in his own system.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's this kind of like fantasy idea that there are, and I mean, who knows, maybe it's true. I can't say for sure. I'm not omniscient, but there's this fantasy idea that there's these people who are like super enlightened and really healthy and also are these like evil puppeteers. And I think that that can't be true. I think that if you're an evil puppeteer, you're actually already in prison as an evil puppeteer. Because you believe what you need to do is control all of this stuff, which is actually the essence of the prison.
To be in a prison, yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that, you know, whoever is running whatever, like the liberated people who would be, I mean, I'm not fully familiar with, you know, what constitutes a philosopher king, but
I am, so you can ask me.
Yeah, have one right
yeah.
there
I mean,
with
is a philosopher king actually somebody who's truly kind of in this liberated place where they understand that to be sort of free and to be wise is to continually engage with this sort of pursuit of reason or something? I mean, like, what's a philosopher king?
Well, Plato would distinguish between a philosopher and a philosopher king. So
Okay.
in a cave allegory, a philosopher would be somebody who gets out of the cave. So they see reality as it is, and ultimately they see the sun, which is basically God, the source of everything. The philosopher king is somebody who then turns around, having had that illumination, and goes back down into the cave to rule people for their own good in light of what she's seen. And by the way, we say philosopher king, but Plato thinks that women are as eligible to be
So
leaders.
philosopher queens are also...
I always teach philosopher queens because that just reminds people of the point that they forget. They slip back into philosopher king.
So Susan would fall into that category?
Well,
In the sense of teaching Lacey, at the very least. She didn't have to stop for her and then try to get her into her track.
I was just about to ask about her kind of liberation. It's not a political liberation. She's not coming and reforming society. She's coming down and addressing an individual. I've heard in Buddhism these are called bodhisattvas. People come down and their job is to liberate single individuals, not to become rulers. Where are we going with asking about philosopher king?
Well, I mean, I guess what I was saying is that, like, you know, I've spent a lot of time really trying to understand and actualize, like, liberation in my own life.
Yeah.
Like on the way over here, I was listening to Leonard Cohen. You know, it's like a bird on the wire. You know, like it's like I've tried in my way to be free, right? I've tried in my way to be free, and there's so many blind alleys and so many different ways in which you think you're being free, and then you discover again that you're again
doing the same old thing.
Yes.
Right. And so the, you know, what it is to be on a liberatory path or what it is to live in freedom is quite challenging.
Yeah.
And I can't say that I've mastered it.
Yeah. And I think it's about being on the road. You know, I think it's about the path. I've tried in my way to be, I think it's the trying. I think that's where the juice is, not the destination, but simply, you know, becoming free. It's not about being free. It's about becoming free.
Let's talk about Susan, since you raised her. So, I mean, she's the best candidate for a liberator in this episode. How successful is she at liberating Lacey? What techniques does she use?
It's a really good point. I was mentioning to Patrick before that in my inflated sense of self, when I think about myself as a psychologist, I like to think of myself as a Susan figure in some ways. That what, at least in part, what I'm hoping to, the kind of presence I'm hoping to bring to my work is one of helping people liberate themselves, helping people see through certain things, and find in their own way to get on a path toward greater, I know that authenticity, that word is loaded, but something more real.
So here's where I'm coming from with this question. You know, Plato has this allegory. The philosopher goes back down to the cave. Now, sometimes to restructure the whole society, but sometimes just to liberate one more person who can then come up. But he describes how difficult that liberation is. So you free someone from the shackles. They don't want to turn around. That's the only reality they've ever known. And if you get them to turn around somehow by words or by main force, you're turning them towards a fire, which is bewildering for them. They've never seen it. And it's not just they become confused and afraid. They become angry because you've done that to them. They see it only
Same thing in
as
psychotherapy.
Well,
it's
that's
like
what
you
I'm
can't
coming
liberate the person. You have to help them come to the realizations on their own. You have to just support the environment such that they're able to tune into themselves and come to organically over time
That's why I like this portrait of Susan. She doesn't say, honey, you're seeing it all wrong. This is the way it is. What does she do? She asks her a few questions that are going to stick in her mind, and she gives her some whiskey.
I think even the biggest thing she does is just her example of herself.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and you know, she says something like, "Oh, you remind me of me," and you know, Lacey's aghast. She's like, "No, not now." You know? But the I remember as a young person, when I started to make my way in the world, you know, I had a few key experiences early on with some adults who were, I thought, pretty exemplary examples of adults, because there were a bunch of adults that I knew or had met who I thought were morons, and I wanted nothing to do with that kind of adulthood. But every once in a while I'd meet someone who really radiated something, a certain kind of power and a certain kind of integrity, certain kind of dignity, a certain kind of honor. And also usually that involved a sense of humor and a kind of like candor, you know. And whenever I would run across one of those people, I would think to myself, like, okay, that's the kind of person I want to be like. Because somehow this person is like inside their own skin, and it feels natural to them to be who they are. They're not fake. They're not lying to themselves. They're not lying to other people. They're not doing things that they don't believe in. Like this person is, you know, the authenticity or reality, like what we're talking about here, is they're aligned with their own, like their inside and the outside match up, right?
Yes.
So I had, okay, go ahead.
No.
Well, I had a very different experience, and this probably says more about my own problems, but I looked up to professors. I was so long in graduate school and also undergrad professors. But when I look back, I realized the ones that I admired at the time that I wanted to be like they weren't charlatans, but there was something showy about them that was very appealing to, I mean, there was something cultish about them. The professors who attract a lot of students, not always, but often, are the ones who are appealing to the mentality of a 25-year-old. And what I recognize in retrospect, there's certain professors that I don't want to say I barely noticed them. I respected them. I took class with, but I didn't think like I want to grow up to be like him. But now that I look back, I think, boy, if I could grow up to be like him, I'd be really happy.
So is it like a big ego thing? I mean, like the professors who had this sort of big ego, so to speak.
Yeah. They had the many books. I could go home and read their 8 books and then come in and talk to them. And they had a philosophy. And
so you
everything.
respected their accomplishments.
Yes, and then also their personality in class. You know, they had a certain wit.
Like charisma.
Yeah, charisma. But it was more the soft-spoken, the humble professors who didn't stand out. But then when I look back, I realized, wow, he always told the truth. He was always good to his students. Just simple stuff
I think that says
you
a
take
lot
for
about
granted
where
25.
you're at in your, it's about your developmental period. Yeah.
I mean, I'll admit I've always liked some charismatic people, but the ones I liked the most were the ones who also had integrity.
Yeah.
You know, like one of my key professors that I really looked up to was this guy named Alan Dundes, who was a folklorist at your University of California at Berkeley, and he was a charismatic guy. He was big and huge and fat and ugly and sexy. Like I was like, how do I think this guy is sexy? You know, and
Greek boys had that view about Socrates. He was ugly, but they could not resist
he was.
him.
I tell you what, like he really had a thing, you know, and he had a ton of dignity and integrity.
Yeah.
And there was like a kind of unconditional love that flowed from him that was like the essence of what's a great teacher in a way, right? Like he just had this knowledge he wanted to share, and he shared it in a way that was really, you know, he was a teacher. He was a teacher. But the thing is that, you know, that's part of the thing about the perils of like, who do you look up to, right? Like the perils of trying to find freedom. Like how do you find the right models? Like where do you go? And, you know, I mean, I've certainly followed people that I shouldn't have. You know, but the idea that like, you know, now freedom is being on the road, but I think there are accomplishments along the way. And there's a way in which now at my age, I would no longer compromise myself in the way that I would have when I was 25.
And by compromise, you mean?
Like go against my
betray your...
I wouldn't betray my better judgment in certain ways. I mean, I still am liable to make mistakes because I'm not dead yet. But there's certain mistakes I used to make all the time because I was really out of alignment with a sort of harmonious understanding of the nature of my being.
And that alignment is so vital, that ability to go down into oneself. These are just metaphors, of course, but it's sort of the antithesis of the world that's presented in Nosedive, of being so outer directed, so externally oriented. It's like the participants in that system, it would be very difficult to be able to access something, one's interiority, a kind of inner sanctuary.
Well, you're cynical is too strong a word, about Lacey's prognosis.
Yes. I think it's a step.
Yes, right.
Yeah, no, it's clearly
it's
a step.
weekend enlightenment workshop.
No. Like the question is, will she integrate or not? Right?
Yeah,
that's the question for sure.
Well, for the listeners who haven't read Dr. Karin Arndt's dissertation,
all of you,
she describes 8 women, I think,
yeah,
who go on retreats of various lengths and emerge
silent, solitary,
who emerge from that solitude. Different, more mature women as a result. And so I guess I wonder, can't you see her being in prison and taking prison as a kind of solitary retreat?
Well, I forget who it was, but I think it was one of the Desert Fathers would say, go into your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Because there are no distractions, because you can't go anywhere, because there aren't other humans to be reflected back to yourself and to perform for. Your feet are held to the fire in that instance where you really have to confront your shit.
And you don't think she will, I guess. I mean, we're speculating.
I mean, again, this isn't black and white. I think that it's helpful to her. Yeah. But the idea that she would emerge from that and become a Susan or find some way to have a balance between being being a participant in the system, but also being, sort of her own person. I think that's too much to ask. And I think that change happens over time. Yeah. And that person oftentimes, like with Susan, has to experience, unfortunately, a trauma to really have a shift. Unless there is a larger cultural container, there's a larger sort of framework in order to help the person make that change in their lives.
In a later monologue of this podcast, I'll talk about Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, and one of the many lessons of that play is that Oedipus, who's this proposed to be this great investigator of truth, he really only finds the truth through suffering. It's only when he's confronted with the fact that he killed his father and slept with his mother that his whole world is shattered. Up to that point, all of his thinking accomplishes nothing.
Yes.
So, Karin, do you think that this experience is not traumatizing for her?
That's a good question. I think it is traumatizing for her. Yeah, that's a good point.
I guess my take on it was that, because I'm really interested in your take on it, because my take on it was that, in fact, she's totally screwed now. And that coming back from this actually may not really be an option, that she might have lost everything. I don't know what it costs you to have been put in jail.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Costs her job, certainly.
She certainly lost her job.
Yeah.
Maybe her home.
She's definitely lost her home.
You needed 4 or 5 to have a home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, she might be able to sleep on the couch of her brother's friend's place.
Right.
A skanky-ass cave.
Yeah. But the thing is that I like the idea that she would be able to come back from this. Because,
you mean economically. I think Karin was
not
talking
even
psychologically.
But as you're talking, Amanda, I'm realizing that, this was a major psychological... I mean, she had to face her deepest fear. Yeah. That public humiliation.
Yeah. Well, and she really went for it. She had a serious breakdown here.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big deal. There's a bunch of different times when I personally would have turned back. Maybe when I got ditched on the when I got ditched by the cosplay people on the side of the road. Yeah. That might have been when I called it a day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because Naomi told her not to come. At that point, that might have been when I called it a day.
Yeah.
Right. But something went click in there, and she was like, "No, I'm going to come and I'm going to do my speech," and she really started to lose it there.
Yeah.
And my concern for her was that this might go down on her permanent record, right? you know what I mean? Because the thing about that rating system is that it fluctuates pretty. You can do there's actually kind of a lot of play in that system.
Yeah.
Because it's all hyper moment by moment.
Right.
So like you can go up and down, and like people fluctuate. It's not a permanent
Like she could have
record.
been videotaped at the wedding doing that.
She
and then
was
becomes
videotaped.
Becomes a
Sure she
social
was.
Yeah, she
heroine.
was videotaped.
Although I don't know if there's any.
Oh, right. Good.
Yeah.
YouTube star.
Yeah.
But that might not be possible in this world.
I'm sure it is the viral idea. You know what I mean?
But the idea that there's even a YouTube channel where people can,
right.
Well,
they have a feed. We don't
Yeah.
know where that goes. But the thing is that the idea that like she might now be semi-permanently totally screwed.
Yeah, that's true.
And so
She might-
that was my interpretation of it,
Right.
is that if she were to come back from this, like getting back to 4.2 might take a lifetime.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because she's done a series of things that are so egregious.
Yeah.
And she was under the double
damage, but
Double
only
damage.
for 24 hours.
Yeah, but all that damage that she took was during that double damage period.
Like what happens when you're down to zero?
What happens
and
when you're down
get-
to zero? Do they euthanize you? We don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Like do you live in not even a van down by the river? We don't know what happens down there.
Well, implicit in what you're saying is something I've been meaning to say all the time, which is about this fluctuation of reputation. It's like in life. It takes a long time to build a good reputation. You can lose a good reputation in an instant.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays with a viral video.
Yeah.
So Justin Trudeau builds his reputation for years and years, and then one photo
Or like
three.
I'm afraid as a psychologist that someone's going to give me a bad, create a bad review for
Yes.
me online. And I think about that sometimes when I am dealing with a business owner and I have a complaint, that business owner, if they know I'm complaining, like I don't dare put any negative things on Yelp,
Yes.
for example,
Yes.
because I'm afraid they'll Google me, find out that I'm a small business owner,
Yes.
and then give me a bad review, even if,
wouldn't
of course,
doubt
I've
it.
not seen them in therapy.
Right.
But it is a social control system and has kept my lip buttoned in a
Yes.
lot of ways. I've had to be a lot more careful to protect myself.
That's interesting because we were talking the other day about the difference between thought control and the academy, and you said
Yeah.
coming out of the academy, you felt like you were
I felt
free,
so liberating.
Oh yeah.
and yet you got into a different
Oh my God.
system.
I got into a different system. I'm a small business owner now.
Yeah.
It's a different
So-
animal.
Is it greater, lesser thought control, or just different?
I mean, overall, I would say it's much better
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, it was such a wonderful shift for me to move outside of institutions and particularly academia, which I had been not just working as a psychologist and before that a graduate student, but before that working as a research assistant. And then, I just spent I spent a good 20 years of my life almost in academia. And I didn't realize the system I was in until I stepped out of it and began to use language more freely, just to be more myself. I mean, it
Like
was
Lacey.
like Lacey.
I tell you what, you guys, I graduated with my PhD 7 years ago. And every year since then, I've gotten more and more happy to be away from the academic institutions. Not because I don't love to learn and not because I don't love to teach.
Yeah.
But, and even like the reason I'm not a licensed clinical psychologist is that I can't be that tight in that system either, because you do have to be very careful with your reputation as a licensed clinical psychologist.
Yeah, I could get sued so easily.
You can get sued, but not even that. It's like you can't even really. It's like part of the nature of that work requires a confidentiality, which means you can't defend yourself. So,
right.
so the thing is that, like, if something were to happen to you, like if somebody were to attack you in some kind of way, there's all kinds of issues, both ethical and political and professional and otherwise, about how you would or would not represent yourself, like in public. And for me personally, like that level of like needing to be discreet in public, I can't manage it.
Yeah.
Like I need to drive a truck instead.
Yeah. And yet I would probably, if my reputation was ruined by some bad review or something, because really, I mean, you Google somebody, you see this one rating and it's like, you're fucked.
Right.
But I would probably hire one of those reputation defenders.
Right.
Well, wouldn't we all? I mean,
And then they would create a whole bunch of false reviews under different names, over the course of a year to make it look like it didn't happen all at once.
Right.
And wouldn't we all? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, because the thing is that I think, one of the things that I appreciate more and more the older I get is that I think one of the primary tasks for adult human beings is to, make sure the world goes on. That's kind of what we do as adults. And that involves not starving to death as the number one thing that you need to do, right? The number one thing you need to do if you're going to make the world go on is you're not going to starve to death. And then after that, there's a whole other set of levels that you can unlock about what's going to happen.
Yeah. So I have a love-hate relationship with the Academy, mostly love. I love writing and teaching and learning the things that you mentioned earlier, but I also experience the thought control. I just wanted to give an example relevant to this episode that I think perhaps the line in this episode that really crystallizes what's going on is when she points the knife at Naomi and says, "You fucked Greg." So I teach this episode as the other Black Mirror episodes in my course on Black Mirror and philosophy. And I want to be able to say that because I think that's the most important line in the entire episode.
It's so good.
But a professor at Louisiana State University lost her job because she said fuck in class.
Really?
Now, there were probably other problems. They probably used that as an excuse. There's always a backstory. But nonetheless, having heard that story, there's no way I'm saying fuck in class. No way. Why would I risk it? So in this case, I just said, Naomi, Lacey points a knife and says something. Well, and I tell them the story about Louisiana State, and they're like, "Ooh, this is all this is edgy." And I say, "Well, any of you, please say the line from the movie for me." And then there's one guy who wants to say.
But wouldn't you need to give trigger warnings to the children before someone?
Children.
I'm terrible. I'm terrible.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to trigger warnings, I have started giving trigger warnings for the Black Mirror episode. I was actually asked by my TA, and I talked to the undergraduates about the kinds of things that they found upsetting in Black Mirror. Students had already been through the course. And of course, there's violence. There's sexual violence. There's explicit sex, and there's pornography. But they also said drug use and foul language. And I said, wow. I'll give trigger warnings for sexual violence and maybe some explicit sex, but not for foul language and not for drug use. The thought that a college student would need to be protected from seeing someone doing a line of cocaine. What the thinking there is absurd.
You know what though? I mean, I honestly, I don't fully understand because obviously now I'm too old, but it's like some of the younger people, like, they're kind of squares. Well, I mean, they are
more. The studies show they're more square.
Yeah,
our generation.
When we were growing up, drug use, I think, in some ways, was more prevalent in a way. It's like now they all take Xanax because they're prescribed it.
Right.
But the like people doing lines of coke, that may not be as normal as it might have been in the olden days.
Patrick, what have you found to be? Because I mean, the Black Mirror series is so disturbing. I mean, Nosedive is a reflection of our society to some extent, and it is us. I mean, all of the episodes are that to some extent. Like, that is deeply disturbing. How are you finding the undergraduate students to be responding to the series and what it evokes in them?
I've been surprised about the ones that they like and dislike. So one of my favorite episodes is the Waldo moment, and I had to stop teaching it because they have no interest in the Waldo moment.
Is that the one with the cartoon political thing?
Yes. I mean, it's Trump forecast in 2013. Maybe that's why they don't like it. Maybe their parents voted for Trump and they find it cuts too close to the bone. I'm not sure.
Were they just bored by it or disturbed by
bored.
it?
Yeah, they just didn't find it interesting. And, the university where I teach...
They get to have it in real life.
Yeah, right. True. True. The university I teach, as you know, it's just not a political place. It's not Berkeley, for example, where I expect the Waldo moment would catch on like fire.
Actually, the University of California at Berkeley, while I was there, was a fairly conservative institution.
Oh, really?
The town of Berkeley was known as the People's Republic of Berkeley. But the actual Berkeley, the college they had kind of gutted their humanities departments.
Yes.
So it was a lot of people going to medical school.
Oh, okay.
That's interesting.
It's not the way it was in 68.
No.
I worked for the psychology department. It was very, very conservative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a lot of like very hardworking Californian young people.
Yes.
Trying to be at the top of the heap. Yeah. And I was one of the few dirtbags that went to the school.
Nice.
So I've got one more question about the episode, and then I'll invite you both to ask me questions or raise topics that we haven't raised. And it's a minor episode, but I find it very interesting, especially as it reflects on the whole series. So she's driving that late model Czech car, and she
was
runs
it
out
Czech?
Of,
Is that what it was?
Czech, yeah. And why Czech? Who knows? But She runs out of energy and she has to go to this fueling station to get recharged, and she doesn't have the adapter that she needs. And so she goes up to the guy in the booth and she says, can I have an adapter?
Well, no, he tells her she needs an adapter because she's like, this doesn't fit.
Oh, that's right. That's right. There you go. All kinds of innuendo. And he's listening to pornography, as we know.
Yes.
We don't see the screen, but we hear it through his headphones, which he takes off.
And she can hear it.
She can hear it, and you can see the expression on her face. He's not helpful. She says, thanks, you're super helpful, clearly sarcastic, and then gives him a 5. And he gives her a 2 out of 5.
Yeah.
And I love this line from the guy who's listening to pornography.
Yes.
She says, why in the world did you give me a 2? And he says, it was not a meaningful encounter.
I thought that was hilarious.
It's perfect.
The reason I like it as a reflection on the whole series, again, because I'm teaching this series at a Catholic university. And in fact, the week before, I taught 15 Million Merits that has pornographic scenes, that the citizens of that world are forced to watch. And, I can imagine administrators or students coming after me saying, you're showing pornographic at a Catholic university. What are you doing? I think this is a great critique of, maybe not of pornography, but of Nosedive, by saying even somebody who is watching pornography, the most meaningless kind of human encounter you can imagine, is saying that social encounter we just had is not meaningful. In other words, what gets taken as meaningful and innocuous could actually be more vicious and dangerous than pornography. So I guess in the end, I'm saying it's not a criticism of pornography. It's not promoting pornography, but it's saying whatever you think of pornography, this is worse. Everyday niceness is worse.
Well, fake niceness, right? Like bullshit niceness.
Yeah. Well, there's something a little, even though, of course, pornography is very, whatever it is, like very, just the right angle, and people are performing. Sex is pretty real. It might not be meaningful in a certain way, especially pornography, as the mainstream pornography is these days, but it's extremely real.
It's Dionysian. It disrupts the efforts of social control. It's like comedy. People find things funny and people find things sexy that they're not supposed to find sexy or funny.
Yes.
No matter their morals or politics.
Yeah.
Well, and you know what just occurred to me is that he's another man calling bullshit on her thing. Yeah. Right? Where it's like...
ATV, pornography, that's kind of...
Yeah, well, it's the brother,
Yeah.
So the brother...
And Susan is clearly androgynous, too.
Yeah, well, and she's an older lady who's like, she's like...
She's a trucker.
She's a trucker.
She's a trucker.
Yeah. Yes,
right,
exactly.
so we've got the brother, we've got Chester. We've got Susan, we've got the guy at the charging station, the porno guy.
And then the guy in the jail.
The guy in the jail and the ATV guy.
Yeah.
And then it's even like the douchey husband who has to try to take her down, right? Like there's all of these...
Did you mention the taxi driver too?
And the taxi driver.
Yeah, all masculine
right? All
characters.
These masculine characters are like...
I really think there is something very gendered about this. I mean, I think it's a reflection to a great extent of the feminine psyche under the contemporary corporate capitalist paradigm, whatever, I don't know what words to use, but in some ways this is an indictment of the panopticon and how it plays out. Obviously men are impacted as well, but there's something different. I mean, her name is Lacey too. I mean, you can't get more feminine than Lacey.
Lacey Pound.
Lace. I mean,
True, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's interesting. I feel like, I actually am not of the opinion that men are freer than women, because I in many ways feel that men are even actually way worse off than we are about some certain things in terms of their gender roles. But the ability to call bullshit on a certain kind of nice, men are certainly freer about that. And I really think that there's like this way that women, and I'm not even that kind of woman. And when I run into certain women, I'll be like, ah! Like I actually will do the squeal under certain circumstances. And I notice myself doing it. And I think, oh my gosh, like me too. Here I am. Oh, not even hashtag me too, but just like squealing me too. Finding myself in this position where I'm supposed to show enthusiasm in a certain kind of way. I'm supposed to show like appreciation in a certain kind of way. I'm supposed to be flattering.
Yes.
I'm supposed to do all of these things because my job is to make sure that like the social fabric doesn't get disrupted. right? All these dudes are going to be splashing mud in everybody's faces. And my job is to make sure that mud splashing doesn't ruin everything.
Yeah.
I'm beginning to suspend judgment about these things because of strange studies that I'm hearing about and seeing. So one was after the Trump-Clinton debates. It was a New York university, I forget which one, but they took the scripts of the two candidates and they had the genders reversed. So they had a man play Hillary in a debate and they had a woman play Trump in a debate. And then they showed it to an audience who hadn't seen the debates and didn't know who. And the estimation of Hillary, the script of Hillary, was much worse when a man played it. In other words, she was able to get away with being mean in a way that a man couldn't get away with.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I found that really interesting too. And I've actually seen it in my workplace. I've seen women get away with being mean.
Yes.
If men had done that, people would be like, what an asshole. But in the case of the woman, she's asserting herself.
Yes.
And that's the academy, which is very special because there's a lot of gender equality and promotion of gender equality and so on.
And frustrated masculinity. Let's be honest.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. And of course, I'm thinking about the actual debate. And was there one debate or multiple debates? But I'm thinking about like the body language and the.
That's true.
I mean, he was coming behind
menacing her. Yeah.
Like there was just this. Yeah.
I didn't watch them.
You didn't watch them. You are so apolitical.
Yeah. Well, no, I hate everyone. Yeah. So but the thing, it's funny thinking about like I remember I had this insight years ago where I was listening to my mother and my aunt have a conversation, and I think my aunt graduated from high school in 1955 and my mother in 1961, so they're really products of the middle of the 20th century, and they really missed the second wave of feminism. So they, it was nurse, secretary, teacher, and so they both became teachers. And they're both actually quite intelligent people. And neither one of them probably should have been teachers, really. I think my aunt should have been an engineer and my mother should have been a saleswoman, because I think they both would have been very talented at that. And I escaped a lot of their situation, not all of it, but they very much were stuck in the Lacey Pound world, where what we would think of today as minor interpersonal slip-ups would cause massive social destruction in terms of being rejected, the children being rejected, the husband being rejected. Like there was this very important sort of social role that women played in this kind of keeping the glue of all these things together. And if you had a wife who made a gaffe, you could be like ruined by that, and your children could be ruined by that. And that was the stakes were really quite high. Today we have all these internet stakes, but the local stakes used to be very serious. And both my mother and my aunt and my grandmother on that side of the family were very aware of the fact that if they did not keep it together and behave in certain kinds of ways, they could get everybody into actual social trouble. Like being ostracized, rejected in a way that would be financially and psychosocially like very bad for people. So I feel like we still have those kinds of things going on. I feel like in some ways we have more freedom, like, you can screw up on the internet and lose everything in an overnight. But in this other way, people kind of don't care as much as they used to. Like people can get away with a lot more crap. You can be like
more drug use, more sexual adventuresome.
And even more flaky stuff like you lost all your money in bad investments. Or like you decided to get divorced.
Oh, that's certainly true.
You changed careers.
Yeah.
There's a way in which we do have more social flexibility than people used to.
And is that why social media took off so much? Because we needed more of a regulatory system. And we needed some way for people to police themselves within the panopticon.
Who knows?
We needed more wardens. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
or like everything started to get so free. Everybody's like, wait, where's the rules?
Yeah.
Let's watch.
Well, that's the Reagan Revolution against the 60s. It went too far. And then that's Nixon. It went too far. We got a law and order.
Well, and now we got psychedelic medicine, so I guess we're back around again.
Yeah,
We're
right?
back around again.
Yeah.
Well,
Take that, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, maybe I could take that as the invitation.
Yeah.
Are there things about this episode that you feel like we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? Questions you want to ask? Points you want to make?
I mean, the big question for me is the obvious question, which is, okay, this is a reflection of our own society today, and certainly where it might be headed in a lot of respects. So what can we do? You know, what can we do to try to be on the path of liberation? What can we actually do?
I think the episode has the answer. Be Susans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe you're looking for structural changes and so on. I don't have political solutions to
Right.
this, but I think try to be a Susan.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? How do we become Susans? How do we cultivate our inner Susans?
Well, I think if you're right, that it takes suffering to shatter your devotion to the social status system.
The addiction, like hitting a bottom.
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
That's going to happen to all of us at a certain point. But instead of being crushed by it, seeing some meaning in it, namely, all right, now I'm free of this burden that I had before. Mm-hmm. I've lost it all. I've lost my husband. I've lost my job or whatever. But now I can be a Susan. Mm-hmm. What is that? I can talk to a Lacey and, give her a few words such that if this happens to her, she won't be lost.
Yeah. It takes so much courage to be a Susan. Amanda, you mentioned psychedelics. What do you see as their role in this, possibly, in individuals liberating themselves from the contemporary matrix? You mentioned the rise, the re-rise, the return.
The return.
Yeah, Nixon tried to suppress them.
Yeah, the return.
Yeah.
Well, it successfully tried to repress them, I'd say. Well, I think that, I've pretty much dedicated my life to trying to be liberated myself in whatever way I can to help other people liberate themselves. And I don't think you necessarily need psychedelics to do that. I think that they can be of service, particularly when they're deployed, wisely. A lot of people will use psychedelics just as a party thing, and I kind of don't think that's a great idea. Although I'm not in charge of them, they can do whatever they want. Like as a liberatory stance, like people can do whatever they want. I'm not their boss. I'm not in the panopticon. But I think that being able to see that the conventional rules that we follow are often merely cultural. Now, they're not necessarily wrong or bad, but they're not like eternal truths a lot of the time, Like, is the thinnest woman the most attractive? That's not an eternal truth, that the thin woman is the most attractive, right? That's a particular way of seeing, and I'm not even against people thinking that necessarily, but it's not an eternal truth. And if you're interested in this question of like what's truly good, you can't marry yourself to the things that aren't the deepest form of truth. You have to be willing to let go of the thing. You have to be willing to recognize, I'm a little fat, but I'm beautiful too. Or I can be beautiful too. Maybe I'm a little bit fat and I'm not beautiful because I'm also a jerk. You know what I mean? You have to wrestle with these things. And I think that the people who are on those paths, helping the people who are coming up on those paths to wrestle with that stuff in a systematic way is, the thing I'm devoted to doing.
Yes.
Because, I try to show up and be real and compassionate with whoever I'm working with.
Yeah.
In whatever context I'm working with them.
Yeah.
And sometimes all that, it's like sometimes the movement a person can make towards being, more honest is really small. But even my help with them going a quarter of an inch is helping everybody go a quarter of an inch. Yeah. That's how I see it.
Yeah. It's a way of being on the road. It doesn't matter how much movement you actually make, but just the
just keep going.
Yeah. Keep going.
And if you can share it with other people in a way that truly helps them, and you're not just bossing them around as another version of the panopticon, which is also very hard to know.
Yeah, right?
True.
That's the gift I would give.
Yeah.
How about you? What do you think?
I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but I think that, as I mentioned earlier, that idea of interiority and the ability to tap into what one's felt sense is they're actually experiencing within themselves. Not that that's separate from the context in which it's happening, but there is an ability that I think that we're progressively losing touch with. Now, I'm not sure if that's true, but I get the sense that with things like social media, with the internet in general, that technologies like that are keeping us from ourselves, keeping us internally occupied, externally, keeping us eternally distracted. And if we can practice the art of cultivate the ability to tune into our experience, our emotional experience, our actual sensations in our body. I know, Amanda, you've done a lot of research on focusing, that technique that really helps people get in touch with that. My research on solitude, the idea of going off alone without technologies, maybe electricity, but no computer, no phone, not seeing anyone for weeks on end. I mean, there's only a certain kind of person that can really, this isn't advised for a lot of people, but
I'm not sure I could do it.
That ability where you really take out those things that people reach to keep themselves from themselves. And they're forced to really be with what is arising within themselves and in their experience of the immediate external world, not the virtual world and not the world of their thinking mind. Anything we can do to try to recover our access to that interiority. I'm saying interiority, but there's a lot of ways to describe that. But I think anything that we can do to try to be connected to ourselves and our experiencing, because that's what's getting forfeited. That's, the whole idea of the panopticon is that one is externally oriented and sort of adopts external, the internalized panopticon, the idea of adopting the external gaze onto oneself. So one is never really alone. They're always being watched and monitoring themselves. But that ability to just sort of sink into one's experiencing without those addictive things that we turn to get out of that, because it's uncomfortable, especially if we haven't really been making contact with that. Anything we can do in that regard. And psychotherapy is certainly not the only means. I would never say that psychotherapy is for everybody and it's a cure-all. Never say that. But certain forms of psychotherapeutic work can help a person really reconnect to something else beyond the horizontal, linguistically based, social sphere, human-oriented, I'm not saying this right, but basically, the matrix, right? Like there are ways, and one of the ways out of the matrix is through reconnecting to one's feeling life, reconnecting to one's imaginal life.
That's the solution for Lacey, at least according to Susan. I'm imitating Susan here. When you yelled at that flight attendant, how did it feel?
Yeah.
And Lacey's first answer is, well, terrible, because I lost social status. But how did it feel when you screamed? Yeah. Which anticipates how she'll feel when she screams, "You fucked Greg," which is the beginning of her freedom, which is consummated in the prison. There she really feels free in the prison when she's screaming the same obscenities. Yeah. So we have 3 instances of obscenities. I never noticed this. The flight attendant, the wedding reception, and then the prison, each time becoming a little more free until finally she is.
Actually, the brother said she fucked Greg first.
Yes.
And she's like, she didn't fuck Greg.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then she takes a big draft of wine. No, more than a swig.
Well, it's like, one of the ways that I like to think about it is that, so, the inside of my body, whatever that is, because it's pretty weird once you start going in there. But the inside of my body, the more I can turn up the volume on that, so that's the soundtrack I'm listening to. That's the soundtrack of my life these days. Yeah, is my own inner, like taka 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 taka, whatever that is. Like whatever the soundtrack of my body is. Yes, that needs to be at the highest volume. Yeah, and then everybody else's I can pay attention to, and even in the work that I do, I often tune in very carefully to the soundtrack of other people. But that's always in the context of the soundtrack of my body, which is how I stay grounded. Yes. And so the liberatory thing, I think, honestly, is, can everybody be listening to their own soundtrack?
Yeah.
And really be tuned to like their tempos and rhythms? Can you hear your own melodies?
Yeah.
Can you be playing your own, flute solo?
Yeah.
Whatever it might be that's going
Yeah.
on for you that has to do with like the actual,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, like feeling or soundscape
Yes.
of your being.
Yes.
Like, can that be the one that you're hearing all the
Yes.
time?
Yes.
And if you can hear that most of the time, all the time, the more that you can hear
Yes.
that, that's sort of what we
Yes.
might mean by like authenticity
Yeah.
in scare quotes, right?
Yeah.
It's that your sound, your signature, your frequencies, to get into that Marianne Williamson place.
Oh,
So
here we
your
go.
frequencies can start to kind of come through.
Yeah.
And then when that's the case,
Yes.
all of the other stuff that's coming at you from all of the other places, all of
Mhm.
the other people, all the other messages that you get, you can start to hear how
Yeah.
they sound with you.
Yeah.
And whether or not they form a kind of a harmony or a dissonance
Yeah.
or a disruption, or if they're trying to drown you out
Yeah.
or whatever. And then you can start being as real
Yeah.
as Susan, right? Because Susan
Yeah.
is just like, hey, hon,
Yeah.
she said, I started saying whatever I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, did it feel good.
Boy, did it feel good.
Yeah.
Some of my friends didn't like honesty.
Yeah.
They acted like I took a shit at their dining room table.
Their breakfast
At
table.
the breakfast table.
Their breakfast even
At the
worse,
breakfast
yeah.
table.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it's like, yeah,
She did take a shit. I mean, she brought the real into the room. The
yeah,
thing that we're protecting ourselves from. The body.
everybody poops.
Everybody poops.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's-
Nature. The real, like,
The-
we
yeah,
haven't
that's-
even talked about, like, the disconnection from the non-human natural world
Yeah.
and what that has to do with that kind of situation they find
Well, and
themselves
she
in.
has to like break
Yeah.
into the place in the woods and goes in the mud.
Well,
Yes.
I mean, when she's making the tapenade,
Oh God.
very greasy
Oh
and
yeah.
dark, and
Yes.
she's stirring it, and the brother's like, what in the world are you doing? And then Naomi calls, and then she stains herself, like, oh,
Yeah.
I have to be perfect for Naomi.
Yeah.
I have to deny this greasy thing, even though she's making it to imitate Naomi's
Like,
fiance.
Boyfriend,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's tapenade. Actually, you know what? When I was watching that, it reminded me of what it was like when I first moved to California, and I had to like get classier because
yeah.
people were so much more
improved
sophisticated
food
about
game,
food.
yeah.
I worked in Chez Panisse.
Oh
I
man,
can tell you all
Yeah.
about
I
that.
can't believe.
Right,
Yeah,
we're on
'cause
our knees here.
I mean, I lived in Mexico, but I moved there basically from like, Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Wonder Bread.
And we were,
Yeah.
we were still punching
Velveeta
holes.
cheese.
Yeah, well, it's
Yeah.
like, carnation condensed milk,
Yeah.
whatever. I mean, not really that bad, but it was like, oh, you have, what is this, hummus?
An avocado?
Avocado.
Yeah.
I didn't eat avocados for years. I was like, I can't eat that. I
Yeah.
don't know what that is.
That's
That's
so
really,
shocking
it
to
looks
me
like
upon
snot. I
moving there.
can't
Yeah.
deal with that. Yeah. Now, of course, I have the avocado toast like all the millennials, but I don't know. So where are we?
We are at the end.
We are at the end.
Yes. So I want to thank you both so much for joining the program. And listeners who have enjoyed this conversation, you can look forward to an individual conversation with Karin Arndt about San Junipero. And you can look forward to a conversation with Amanda Lowe about Men Against Fire.
Man Against Fire.
And speaking of soundscapes, the listeners will hear the decline of our voice and then the return of the original theme music, which, by the way, I'm going to take my first opportunity to mention, was composed and played by Louis Butler.